All right, gang. Good day. Today is Tuesday. I posted the intro video yesterday and mentioned that I would be following up with our first content video for the semester, which is the intro orientation to General Semantics. There's a little preface reading by Irving Lee, and that's the intro or the preface to the book Language, Habits, and Human Affairs. There's also a video by Irving Lee. It looks ancient when you watch it. I should probably get the exact date on that. But yeah, perhaps late 40s, something like that, 1940s. And this video will be focusing on the readings. The Stanley Fish, just a couple of pages on that one, which we'll talk about first, and then the preface by Irving Lee, which kind of starts to lay out the problem or what's General Semantics attempting to deal with, why does it exist, what's it all about, right? So do Fish, and then we'll do the preface, and that should do it. You might have noticed correspondingly that there is also something that looks like this, a reading prompt. These are something I started creating a number of years ago in lieu of PowerPoints. I don't like dealing with PowerPoints. But to help with the readings, I just started coming up with these single pages that just kind of list one through whatever, the key moments throughout the reading. And it's focusing on like key ideas, key passages, useful questions, and so on and so on. So it's like a condensed hit list of what you want to focus on for the reading. So between the reading itself, the notes, and the videos, hopefully you have a pretty good way into this material for the first time. So there's a weird reading, and it's not even a full reading. It's just a few pages by this essay by Stanley Fish. You can see at the top here. It's just called Rhetoric. And that comes out of a book. I first encountered it in a book collection of essays called Rhetoric in an Anti-Foundational World. And his is like the first essay in this big, thick volume of major scholars in the humanities talking about rhetoric. Stanley Fish was a major figure in the humanities, sort of like in the English side of things. But he ended up getting interested in law. He wrote for the New York Times as a kind of part-time editorial or op-ed opinion writer. And I think he's still with us, but he's probably pretty on in years at this point, so hope he's well. I actually first fell in love with literary theory as an English major by an essay that I read by Stanley Fish that I just kind of blew my mind. So I have a soft spot for him. And this essay, I often start my classes with this essay because it frames things in a big, broad, but useful way. So let's just jump right in. On page 36, he has just quoted a passage from Milton, Paradise Lost. And he's kind of analyzing that passage. And now he's pausing and he's saying, I have lingered so long over this passage because we can extrapolate from it all of the binary oppositions in relation to which rhetoric has received its largely negative definition. If you've taken class in rhetoric before, you've probably encountered some of this stuff, particularly in reference to Plato and his critique of rhetoric. And the critique of rhetoric that Plato gives is that all it does is it deals with appearances. All rhetoric does to persuade or convince or get some action done is to kind of flatter, seduce, maybe manipulate, maybe intimidate, maybe using fear-mongering, right? So like the use of questionable methods to achieve a certain outcome through discourse, through language, persuasion, argumentation. That was Plato's critique, and it's stuck with us ever since, but that's where we get these binary oppositions. Underlying this list, which is by no means exhaustive, are three basic oppositions, and this is what I want us to focus on right off the bat, these three basic oppositions. And then next he talks about language. So this is kind of the first key part, and then there's one more key part. First basic opposition is between a truth that exists independently of all perspectives and points of view and the many truths. So we have a truth versus many truths that exist, many truths that emerge and seem perspicuous when a particular perspective or point of view has been established and is enforced. So the first opposition is truth that exists independently, it's static, it's permanent, it's just out there in the world, right? Nature has its own kind of truth. The cosmos, laws of gravity. There are these kind of objective truths, and they exist independently of our brains. And even our brains operate according to these kind of objective truths, these maybe designs, you might say. And all of how we feel about that is sort of irrelevant. What matters is the objective fact itself, right? So that's the one view. One truth, objective truth, and then the other opposition is many truths. Truth over here, they might be totally different, but they're operating in their own particular context, or maybe a truth yesterday is not the same as a truth tomorrow, right? So that's the first opposition. The second, an opposition between true knowledge. So first is sort of objective reality. Next is knowledge, right? So the opposition there is between, again, an objective knowledge. What does he say here? True knowledge, which is knowledge as it exists apart from any and all systems of belief. It's true whether or not we care about it, believe it, agree with it. It's just objectively true. And the knowledge that because it flows from some or other system of belief is incomplete and partial. So the opposite to the objective truth is the partial truth, because it flows out of humans and how we understand the world around us. The third opposition is an opposition between a self-consciousness. So now we're talking about, the self, the individual, the human, human individual with a self-consciousness that is turned outward in an effort to apprehend and attach itself to truth. So the belief that our job and our kind of design, our design purpose is to always better understand those objective truths out there, and to orient our consciousness and orient our thoughts accordingly, right? That's the first view. The second one, and a self-consciousness that is turned inward in the direction of its own prejudices, which is far from being transcended, continue to inform its every word and action, right? So basically, these oppositions are between sort of objective, permanent, ordered reality and subjective, dynamic, changing reality, right? Very fundamentally kind of different worldviews. Now, let's think about, so that's about kind of thought and knowledge and how what's going on in here is lining up with going on out there or not. And then there's also the question of language, right? So thought and now language, he says, each of these oppositions is attached in turn to an opposition between two kinds of language. And this is super important. So please take notes, circle, star, highlight. This is crucial. On the one hand, language that faithfully reflects or reports on matters of facts, uncolored by any personal or partisan agenda or desire. And on the other hand, language that is infected by partisan agendas and desires, and therefore colors and distorts the facts and that it purports to reflect. It is the use of the second kind of language that makes one a rhetorician, if you haven't figured that out yet. While adherence to the first kind makes one a seeker after truth and an objective observer of the way things are. That is so important, right? So there's the setup. We have these kind of two worldviews. And in a moment, he's going to call worldview one serious man worldview, the worldview of the serious man. And then the second worldview is the worldview of rhetoric man. And they're kind of fundamentally incompatible, and they operate on totally different assumptions and basic dynamics, right? Serious man believes that the world is ordered, objective, true, stable, permanent, and that our job is to line our thoughts according to the objective, ordered, permanent nature of reality, and accordingly to align our language with our thoughts with external reality. This is what I call the correspondence theory of language, right? So please write that down and note it. I'll probably mention it many times. Correspondence theory, meaning a fact that is out there in the world must correspond with my idea. This is serious man. It must correspond with my idea about that fact. There should be like a mimetic mime in terms of like copy. There should be a copy, essentially, right? Cut and paste. So that fact out there is basically identical in here, and then correspondingly, I'm able to articulate that idea, that fact, in my language, and you are able to receive that fact And when you hear what I'm saying about the external world, it makes perfect sense in terms of the external reality that I'm referring to. It's like a chain, right? And at every point, the links are nicely connected. So external reality, thought, language, communication, coming in, now thought, and now behavior, right? And if we've done our jobs as good, serious men, and if we've been, as Irving Lee will say, as if we have trained ourselves and if we have been disciplined, then we are participating in an ordered reality, right? In an ordered universe. What's out there is reflected in here, it's reflected in there, it's reflected in behavior, policy. Sounds lovely, right? Rhetoric man comes along and says, there's no outside of us. There's no outside of language. There's no outside of science, believe it or not, right? These are all human creations. Language is a human creation. Science itself is a human creation in terms of the methods that we use to try to understand objective reality. It can get us very, very close to what's going on, but it's always at a remove. It's always a method, a process, a way of trying to get further at the objective kind of life world, as the general semanticists call it. 11 minutes. Okay, I need to wrap up here. So we'll talk about this a lot throughout this semester. Serious man is like Plato and the philosophers and Descartes, if you've taken a class with me recently. That's that tradition. Rhetoric man encompasses the traditions of Aristotle, of the sophists, of Isocrates, all of the rhetoricians. Now, obviously, there's differences there, but they all accept the notion that, human subjectivity is malleable, that the world is constantly changing, that language changes, that everything's kind of fluid, right? Serious man hates that idea. Serious man wants order, stability, consistency, permanence, clarity, certainty. So when you think serious man, think certainty. I want certainty. I want to have certain knowledge about what's going on out there. And I want to know that my language is reflecting that with certainty. And so clarity is super important. Getting rid of confusion is important. So obviously the general semanticists are falling into this camp here. And Irving Lee will say in a moment some not terribly flattering things about rhetoric. But so this is the kind of the quarrel. Now, just draw your attention a few pages over is where Fish talks about rhetoric man and serious man. This is the bottom of page 43 he begins. He says in Richard Lanham's, he's borrowing from Richard Lanham here, it's a disagreement as to whether we are members of the species Homo seriosus, serious man, or Homo rhetoricus. On the one hand, Homo seriosus, or serious man, possesses a central self, an irreducible identity, static, permanent, unchanging. These selves combine into a single homogeneously real society, constitutes a referent reality for the men living in it. This referent society is in turn contained in a physical nature itself referential. He's saying referential, that's the correspondence thing. This thing refers to that thing in a mimetic way, corresponds, right? It's reflective, one-to-one, triangle, triangle. If you've ever played the phone game in class, and I actually did that last time I taught this particular class, is I did the little phone game thing where I uttered a sentence into a student's ear quietly at the start of the class and just had everyone share it, and then by the end of the exchange, let's see what we came up with. And it was hilarious. It always is, right? Because you lose things at every point in the chain, right? So that's me complicating the assumptions here. Nevertheless, the assumption of serious man is that there are these sort of stable reference. Man has invented language to communicate with his fellow man. He communicates facts and concepts about both nature and society. He can also communicate a third category of response emotions. Irving Lee will basically say exactly the same as all of this. On the other hand, Homo rhetoricus, rhetorical man, is an actor. His reality is public and dramatic. His sense of identity depends on the reassurance of daily histrionic reenactments. He is thus centered in time and concrete local event, particular places, right? The way that we are experiencing something right now is not necessarily the same as every other similar experience. It's all about particular situations, local situations, because they're different from the other situations, right? So rhetoric man is all about here, now, this. Serious man is about finding these continuities and stabilities, right? The next page, in the middle of 45, he says, which of these views of human nature is the correct one? You're probably wondering that yourself. Then he says the question can be answered only from within one or the other position, right? If you're serious man, then of course that's the right worldview, and rhetoric man is a hopeless irrationalist, right? Just a moody poet or whatever. And if you're a rhetoric man and you're looking at serious man, you're seeing delusion. You're seeing like wishful thinking, essentially. So there's no third position outside of these that can say that one's right, that one's wrong. You more or less have to kind of choose which side you think is more accurate. Sorry, I just saw a delivery guy go by. All right, so that's pretty much it there. The last, that's pretty good for fish. There's just a couple of those key passages in fish that are just so useful and powerful. So that's the way I want to start out by thinking about this class, is by positioning the General Semantic enterprise project within that kind of serious man tradition. And we'll see that as we move into Lee. So let's do that now. And I want to move quicker. So he starts off by talking about confusion. Confusion's the thing he's concerned about. He moves into the big lie. He talks about words as weapons. So here's someone who's concerned about the kind of rhetorical powers of language to distort, to bend truth, to convince people of things that aren't true. You can hear Plato kind of in the background saying, yeah, that's it. So he's concerned about confusion. He's concerned about lack of clarity. He's concerned about deception and manipulation, as we should be, right? Like, it's not that if you're a serious man, that's the only way that you can believe in sort of objective truth, that to be a rhetoric man means like everything's a crapshoot, right? Maybe there's somewhere in the middle that we can talk about in terms of reliabilities, consistencies, knowing full well that these things could change and there could be exceptions, but we'll get to that. So he says on the second page of the top left, we have come to know the influence of climate, temperature, pressure, humidity, the role of the surrounding physical and social conditions, and 1,000 other factors which shape our reactions, but somehow we have not been so sharp in our awareness of the linguistic and evaluational factors about us. So here's a guy coming out of a couple of 100 years of scientific enterprise, where the scientific method was so ascendant and so important, and everyone was trying to be objective and mapping the world empirically and so on. He's saying, look, we've learned a lot about sort of our external world, but we still haven't applied that kind of reason to how it is we talk and think. So right there, he's sort of being a serious man, trying to get serious about how it is we use language, because clearly we've used it poorly, or we've had it thrust upon us. He cites Hitler. He cites all kinds of examples of like propaganda, and he's very concerned about what he calls the organized lie. All right, so the thing that he really wants to focus on, the bottom paragraph on XV1, that's I think 16. In short, we have need of methods, simple, teachable, and usable, by which to break through the conventionalized, stiffly resistant, and confusing habits of evaluation. There's thought. There's the thought part of this class, language and thought. Right? So habits of evaluation. He's basically saying we need to be more trained, more disciplined, more enlightened in terms of how it is we think about language and thought itself. We need to clarify our thought to clarify our thoughts, right? It's this weird kind of teleology. Yeah, circular. Nevertheless, that's really important for the general semantics, right? Habits of evaluation. How is it that we're making judgments and discernments about objective reality in our statements? He wants to tighten that up, to clean that up. Yep. Trying to move quickly here while hitting the relevant parts. Yep. All right, so next he moves into, he sort of acknowledges this distinction, this separation. He doesn't use serious man and rhetoric man, but he's essentially talking about the same thing. He says on the right side on 17, the paragraph begins, the sharp separation of the art of gaining assent, that's rhetoric, from the art of making accurate statements, that is, he calls general semantics. You might say philosophy or even science. Dialectic is what we call it in another class. All right, that's the kind of serious man, rhetoric man distinction. And he tracks it, goes back to Plato, talks about rhetoric in not super flattering ways, right? So he's associating rhetoric with almost like gleeful distortions of truth. He says on 18, top paragraph, middle, or about 7 lines down, he says, the vast battery of procedures for ingratiation, the blandishments, the ways of wheedling, the tested sentences that sell, the disguised flatteries, the easy glibness, the devices of oversimplification. Nice way of describing all these problems. He's talking about rhetoric there, and he's basically saying this is just formalized confusion processes. That's rhetoric. He talks about Hitler. All right, so he's basically saying, like, we've had these two kind of traditions, one focused on deception and one focused on accuracy, and we need to smash them together. That's where he ends off. So top of 20, top left, he says, what we need now understand is this: the separation cannot be permitted. We must train ourselves and our students, the two arts together. The arts of factuality and the arts of rhetoric, ingratiation, appeal, and all the rest of it, right? He says in the next paragraph, or two more, he says, now perhaps as never before are we ready for the reorientation and purpose which will unify the now dissociated arts of language use. That's sort of like a rallying cry for General Semantics. Now more than ever, we're ready to do this. Like, we've come out of these wars, we have suffered all kinds of abuses of meaning, of language use, distortion, manipulation, deception. More than ever, we are oriented to this project of clarification and accuracy achievement. I love on the next page, 22, second paragraph, dead middle, he says, now there's nothing wrong with the study of rhetoric per se. He says, but students will be hopelessly misled if they assume that a rhetorical analysis gives them the results of a semantic analysis. So at this point he's saying, basically, we've got lots of skilled rhetorical scholars who are able to talk about what's going on as diagnosticians, what we in rhetoric called rhetorical criticism, right? He's saying rhetoricians are really good at sort of describing what's going on. They just kind of lose their nerve when it comes to, like, you know, making appeals for how we should be doing things better, right? So he's like basically saying rhetoric scholars aren't going far enough. They need to, like, attach to their diagnosis of all of this, you know, bad language use ways for clarifying language use. I think rhetoric scholars of this time were a lot more devoted to that project than he would admit, but nevertheless, the next page or the next column, 23, second full paragraph, is where we get this kind of key General Semantics, like, trope almost, this business between the map and the territory. And one of the things that General Semantics is known for is, like, insisting on this distinction. The map, the thing that we hold in our hand, or at least we used to before phones, this thing is not the territory out there, right? It's a representation. And so there's lines and colors and shapes and whatever, and it's meant to help orient us and move us through space, but it is not the thing out there. That sharp separation between language and external world is something that's like a bedrock assumption of general semanticists. And therefore, they want to say, like, look, our thoughts are one thing, our language is another thing, and the external life world is yet another thing. And we need to understand them as discrete, kind of separate phenomenon, and we need to line them up. We need to get them to correspond, essentially, right? The rhetoric man side of things would say it's all muddled, it's all interwoven, right? And it's a lot messier than you're saying. In any case, these are the preliminary kind of positions. Toward the end of that same paragraph, he says, the task of the teacher is ever that of giving the means by which the student can himself discipline himself. There's serious man right there. I wrote serious in the margin. Serious man is all about discipline. Discipline your thoughts. Discipline your language use. Think about, I don't even know if this is a real kind of trope anymore, but when I was growing up, the grammar teacher at school was always this elderly woman who was very stern, and she would, like, rap your knuckles if you used a comma wrong, you know, and it's like berate you for not knowing, like, what a clause is or a phrase. That's the kind of serious man tradition of, like, you need to smarten up your language, right? So discipline. And he also talks about training, and he ends this chapter with a kind of funny, dismissive little moment by talking about feelings, right? So on page 25, he says, the other kind of talk, by and large, is in terms which do not sharply relate to concrete and specific observations. This sort of talk cannot be tested by the familiar notions of trueness and falsity. We refer here to talk to which represents primarily what goes on inside the skin of the speaker. Sensations, feelings, right? So it's this very marginal thing, this idea that we are passional feeling creatures. One of the things that we're going to see throughout this semester is like this little bracketed kind of, drive-by mention of feelings will come back to haunt the general semanticists because, what's happened over time is we've become increasingly sense-based, feelings-based, subjective, moral, and that drives so much of how we live our lives today. General semanticists today would probably be going completely wild just thinking about all of the non-objective, non-scientific ways that we communicate and engage with one another. So there we go. That's 25 minutes already. That was kind of tight. As you could tell, I was talking quickly. The fish piece is super important, short, but there's some really robust stuff in there. And then these opening statements by Irving Lee on what General Semantics was responding to, what it's aspiring to, how it thinks about rhetoric, right? And what's coming then will be a number of kind of propositions and statements about how to think about thought, how to talk about language and think about language, and how to do it better. Discipline, training, right? I don't want to be too glib. There are some really important insights in terms of we can always try to improve the clarity of our thinking and the clarity of our thoughts. I think it's probably wise, though, to not assume that there is a perfection, that there's a perfect objectivity and a perfect clarity that we are always kind of striving to achieve. It's the realm of the probable, the more and the less, and the give and the take. So let's get as best as we can at communicating sharply, clearly, with integrity. But let's maybe not assume that there's a perfection, a perfect order, and a perfect harmony and balance and correspondence between inside and outside and language and reception. So these are the kind of questions and themes and issues and topics that we'll be encountering throughout the semester. If it feels like a little bit of a whirlwind tour already, apologies, that's just, getting things going. But we'll be repeatedly kind of visiting these things. So hope that gets the juices rolling a little bit and look forward to more. That's your video content for the rest of the week. And we'll see you next week. Hope all's well, gang.